الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا إنك أنت الجواد الكريم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode in our series on Al-Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya, Islamic legal maxims. We've talked about 4 of the major maxims up until now, and we're going to take a bit of a detour in this episode to talk about a maxim that is not directly under any of the major maxims, but its application is relevant to the application of many of these, particularly the 2 that we have done most recently, which is that hardship begets facility and harm is to be eliminated. So today's maxim in Arabic, it's phrased إِذَا زَالَ الْمَانِعُ عَادَ الْمَمْنُوعُ, and it's translated, when the impediment is removed, the original Shariah rule is restored to full effect. Some scholars mention this as somehow being another phrasing of مَا جَازَ لِعُذْرٍ بَطَلَ بِزَوَالِهِ, that it's connected to this maxim which says whatever is allowed because of a Sharia exemption becomes invalid when its cause disappears. Actually, the maxim that we're talking about is much more comprehensive and general than this one about what is allowed due to an exemption becomes invalid when the cause disappears. We're going to get into all of the applications or the range of issues to which the maxim applies, but in order to understand how Sharia rules are applied to real-world situations, I have to step back a little bit and take a detour into usul fiqh a little bit. So there are trigger characteristics or events that, when they're present, they call for a ruling to be present. And those things are called sabab, which is translated into English as cause. But the cause will not take its effect unless all of the conditions are also present. And if you have the cause and the conditions present, the rule will still not come into effect unless, in that particular case, all of the impediments are absent. So let's take an example. This is not related to a Sharia ruling, but it's just like a concrete example, a metaphor, an analogy for what we're talking about. Let's say that you have a revolver, and in order to fire the revolver, you have to pull the trigger. Pulling the trigger is the sabab. It's the cause for the gun firing. But nothing will happen if there are no bullets in the chamber. So having the bullets in the chambers is like the conditions. The bullets being in the chamber won't cause anything to happen. That gun can sit there for 100 years. It's loaded, but nobody's ever pulled the trigger, therefore the gun will not fire. So the cause for the firing is pulling the trigger, and the condition for that effect coming into being is that the bullets be present in the chambers. But if you have pulled the trigger and you have bullets in the chambers, but the safety lever has been switched on, then the gun will still not fire. So that safety switch would be analogous to the impediments or the mani'. So linguistically, the word mani' is derived from the verb mana'a yamna'u, which means to hinder or to prevent, to detain. So linguistically, a mania is a hindrance or an impediment. Its technical meaning in usul al-fiqh, ما يلزم من وجوده العدم ولا يلزم من عدمه وجود ولا عدم لذاته. A factor whose presence requires, by the assignment of the lawgiver, the absence of a certain rule, whereas its absence does not in and of itself require the presence or the absence of that rule. So let's take an example in order to clarify. A person owns a substantial amount of wealth. He's over the nisab. So that possession of wealth means that it's a trigger event so that zakat would be due upon him. But there's conditions for that. So one of those conditions is that a year should pass over the possession of that nisab. So that's a shart. A mani', an impediment to that rule of obligation to pay the zakat, would be if the person owes a debt and that debt is due. So just because this question I remember came up when I was in America. People asked, well, I'm buying a house, I still owe $100,000 on it, and I have this much money, and so zakat is due on it. So how does my debt affect my zakat? Well, all of that 100,000 is not due when the zakat is due. So that 100,000 doesn't affect the obligation of the zakat. But if you have a payment that's due, and it's like, let's say 10,000, you have to pay it now, and the amount of money that you own is 9,000, then that requirement to pay the debt is a preventive for you being required to pay any zakat, because the debt is a mani', it's an impediment, a hindrance to the obligation of zakat. Linguistically, the word mamnu' can also be translated as prohibited. Okay, but this maxim is not limited in any way to prohibitions. And the word mamnu', if you translated it as prohibited, in this context, that would be a mistranslation. And so therefore, the maxim applies to preventive factors for any kind of a ruling. If there's a preventive factor of obligation and it disappears, then the obligation comes back into effect. If there's something that prevents the rule from being mandub or recommended and it disappears, then the rule is again recommended. Same for the haram, and the same for the makruh, and even for the mubah. Something can be mubah as a de facto ruling, and then a factor occurs which makes it prohibited, and then when it's removed, then the rule returns to its original status. Take an example. The normal obligation is that Muslim men are supposed to pray Salatul Jummah on Friday. Instead of the regular noon prayer, the Dhuhr prayer, you have to attend a congregational Salat, and it's done in those big masjids, so you have big gatherings for those events. If a person is a traveler, then the traveling becomes an impediment for that rule, that obligation applying to that person while he's in that condition. Once he returns home, he's no longer a traveler, and therefore the rule of obligation returns to full force. The same thing with joining prayers because he's a traveler. Once he's back home, he can't join them because he's not in that situation. Now, if we turn to evidence for the maxim, one of the classic examples, Allah said, وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. Allah has made trade lawful, and He's prohibited riba, usury. This is a blanket and a general statement of permission for conducting trade. It includes all types of trade, except if there's a specific evidence against it, and it involves all times. We'll pick up after the break, inshallah. Welcome back. We're talking about al-mani', preventive factors, and how they impede rulings, and then when they disappear, a ruling returns to its original status. So the default ruling with regard to trade is that it's lawful. وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. And so that statement of blanket permissibility covers every kind of trade unless there's specific evidence to exclude a particular form or characteristic. It also extends to time. It's permissible to conduct a trade at 3 in the morning, okay? If somebody says, no, it's not, they are required to bring evidence as to why that is. Okay, with regard to praying at the time of Jummah prayer, there is evidence for that. In Surah Al-Jummah, Allah said, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع. O you who believe, when the call for prayer is made on Friday, then hurry to the remembrance of Allah and desist from trade. So at that point, conducting business transactions becomes haram. After that, there's another rule. فَإِذَا قُضِيَتِ الصَّلَاةُ فَانْتَشِرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَابْتَغُوا مِنْ فَضْلِ اللَّهِ. When the prayer finishes, disperse in the land and seek Allah's bounty. So what was the rule before the adhan? The rule was that trade is permissible. And so during the Jummah prayer, trade is impermissible. And now you have a statement which looks like a command, but it is actually restoring the rule to its previous state, which is that trade is permitted. Now, I heard a case once about government scholars in Algeria who were trying to, on the behest of the government, they didn't like the fact that people were staying after Jummah prayer, and there was kind of learning and teaching sessions going on in the mosque. And they said, you're violating this verse, which says, فَإِذَا قُضِيَتِ الصَّلَاةُ فَانْتَشِرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ. When the salat is finished, then scatter in the earth. And they said, Al-amru yadullu ala al-wujub. Command form, the verb form that indicates a command, its default ruling is obligation. So it means that it's unlawful for you to stay in the masjid after the Jummah Salat. And so that's a gross misinterpretation of the verse. It's a command which restores the rule to its original state after a prohibition. Another example of this from the Shariah text in Surah Qaf, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إذ يتلقى المتلقيان عن اليمين وعن الشمال قعيد ما يلفظ من قول إلا لديه رقيب عتيد. There are two receivers, but for our purposes, there are two angels set to record, one on his right side, one on his left. He utters not a single word without an ever-present watcher. So what this means is that people are responsible for what they say, and that's the basic rule. However, the Prophet ﷺ pointed out that there are exceptions to this state of affairs, which is that if a person is insane, then for him the pen is lifted until he returns to sanity. And if he is a child, then he is not responsible. The pen is lifted until he attains puberty. And if he is asleep, he is not responsible for his acts until he wakes up. And so insanity is a preventive for that basic rule that a person is responsible for everything they say and do. Childhood is also a preventive for that rule, and sleep is a preventive for it. When those conditions and those state of affairs pass away, then the basic rule comes into full effect with regard to those persons. Okay, now let's look at some applications of this rule. If a person is sick, then the normal rule, which is that they're obliged to perform wudu. The sickness is a preventive for that obligation, and therefore they can make tayammum. Once they're no longer sick, then the rule returns to its normal state. And the same would be the case for a person who doesn't find water. So he can make tayammum, and then when he finds water, then finding the water, I mean, there's this famous statement, إِذَا وُجِدَ الْمَاء بَطَلَ التَّيَمُّمُ. When water is found, then tayammum becomes invalid. So you're no longer in a state of ritual purity because the reason for the excuse is no longer there. Even though you didn't pass wind, you didn't do anything that would break your wudu, the very fact that you now have the means to perform the normal act of purification means that this substitute is no longer in effect. You can't use it. A person who purchases a house and lives in it, the fact that they're living in the house prevents that house from being subject to zakat. It's a form of wealth, yes, but it's a form of wealth that's being used. And so because it's being used, then it prevents it from being in that category that is subject to zakat. So if the person moves out of the house and he puts it up on the market for sale, that is now considered urud tijara. It's business merchandise. And that's one of the 5 categories that's subject to zakat. And let's say that a year has passed by, he already owns the nisab, and it's time to pay zakat. Well, he's got quite a hefty amount of zakat to pay now because, you know, let's say he had $10,000, which qualified him to pay zakat. He's had it for a year, and this house is on the market. It's also added to his zakatable wealth. Another classic example, grape juice is lawful to drink. Okay, this grape juice happens to sit out for a while and it ferments. So the sugar in the water is converted to alcohol. So because of that change in attribute, then the rule has now changed. The lawfulness of that grape juice has been impeded by the presence of the alcohol. And so now it's unlawful to drink. Now, if that juice continued to sit out, it became wine, and then it turned into vinegar. There was no human intervention. Then by ijma, consensus of all the schools of Islamic law, then that vinegar becomes lawful to use because the impediment to its lawfulness has been removed when the alcohol converted into vinegar. Some examples from Islamic finance. In Indonesia, the basic rule is that Muslims are not supposed to put their money in conventional banks. And they have these Hajj saving schemes in places like Indonesia and Malaysia where people, they put money into an account in order to save up to be able to make Hajj. These are special Hajj accounts. And the Department of Hajj and the Religious Affairs Ministry in Indonesia, when Islamic banks were just starting out, but they were very small and they didn't have the capacity to handle some of these funds, there was some discussion about it being permissible to continue the accounts in those conventional banks. Since then, the Islamic banks have become firmly established and they're able to handle that size of deposits. And because that earlier set of circumstances is no longer present, then that permission, if there ever was any, has disappeared. There are companies that go through these stock screening processes. In order for Muslims to be able to purchase shares in a company, it has to pass through screening criteria. So its core business activities must be lawful, and then beyond that there are certain kinds of activities which are not its core activities. If they're unlawful, then there are various percentages that scholars have arrived at for threshold. Below it, it's lawful. Above it, it's unlawful. And periodically these stocks are reviewed. So a stock may be non-Sharia compliant due to some factor, and then based on a review, that factor is no longer operative, and therefore it becomes permissible to buy the shares of that stock. So these are some of the examples of how this rule works. Run out of time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik.